Good evening, folks. How are we doing? Welcome back if you're a returning viewer. And welcome back to a slightly unusual week. We are doing a series of charity streams to raise money for Great Ormond Street Hospital. Uh, I have said this before, but I will say it again for the new viewers. Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, a fantastic charity, but one that is close to my heart as I was actually a patient there when I was 6 years old. I went in with kidney failure. And thanks to them, I am alive and reasonably well today. So as part of their Oh My Gosh campaign for this year, I'm doing some charity streams to raise a bit of money for them. A relatively low goal of £100, and we are almost halfway there. We're £48 in of £100. So anything that can be donated, very much appreciated. If you can't donate, that is totally fine. I completely understand. But all I would ask in that case is please share on socials, on Discord, etc. That I'm doing these. It just makes a difference. It really does. Specifically, what we've been doing, we did one charity stream which was replaying the game Alex Kidd in Miracle World, which was the first video game I ever played. I played it on the children's ward at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And ever since, we have been reading Robert Louis Stevenson's classic Treasure Island. Specifically, actually, I'm reading it on screen. I was intending originally to read the physical copy, but I figure in terms of eye strain and in terms of you not looking at the top of my head as I'm reading it, I'm actually just reading it off screen. Makes it a little bit easier. We've read the first 3 parts of the story. There's 6 parts to it. We will certainly be reading part 4 tonight. We may well read part 5 as well. We'll see how we're doing for time, and we'll see how my voice is doing going through this. My intention is still that we will finish the entire book by midnight tomorrow, which is the end of Oh My Gosh week. For those who do not know the story, where are we up to with this? So Jim Hawkins, the cabin boy and our protagonist, is aboard the Hispaniola, or was aboard the Hispaniola, which is the ship that has travelled to Treasure Island to try and uncover the buried treasure of Captain Flint. However, most of the crew are mutineers, led by the ship's cook, Long John Silver. Where we are right now, they have got ashore. They are aware of the fact that Long John Silver was going to betray them from an overheard conversation, and they thought the best way was to try and convince some of them to go ashore, and then they could either, if there were mutineers aboard, they could deal with them. Essentially, they could try and weed out some of the mutineers. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked terribly well. Silver was a step ahead of them, and any loyal men aboard the shore have been killed. Jim Hawkins has come across Ben Gunn, who has been marooned on the island for 3 years, and they're trying to make their way back to the ship. But actually, I believe the narrative is about to jump a little bit as we will get into part 4 of the story. So I hope you enjoy it. I will apologise in advance for any stumbles I make during this. So this is my first time reading an entire significant novel aloud, even if it is over a couple of nights. So I apologise for any stumbles in any of this, and any mispronunciations as well. It's very easily done, and especially with an older book. So I'm just taking a stab at some of the words on here. So apologies if it's not quite as polished as perhaps it would be if this were pre-recorded and edited. But I'm going to take a swig of drink, and we're going to dive back into it. Love it. Love the attitude mash. Oh, last thing before we start, if you do want to donate, please just follow the QR code in the bottom right. Thank you. Okay. Part 4, The Stockade. Chapter 16, narrative continued by the Doctor. Now the ship was abandoned. It was about 1:30, 3 bells in the sea phrase, that the 2 boats went ashore from the Hispaniola. The captain, the squire, and I were talking matters over in the cabin. Had there been a breath of wind, we should have fallen on the 6 mutineers who were left aboard with us, slipped our cable, and away to sea. But the wind was wanting, and to complete our helplessness, down came Hunter with the news that Jim Hawkins had slipped into a boat and was ashore with the rest. It never occurred to us to doubt Jim Hawkins, but we were alarmed for his safety. With the men in the temper they were in, it seemed an even chance that we should see the lad again. We ran on deck. The pitch was bubbling in the seams, the nasty stench of the place turned me sick. If ever a man smelt fever and dysentery, it was in that abominable anchorage. The 6 scoundrels were sitting grumbling under a sail in the forecastle. Ashore we could see the gigs made fast, and a man sitting in each, hard by where the river runs in. One of them was whistling Lully-Bolero. Waiting was a strain, and it was decided that Hunter and I should go ashore with the jolly boat in quest of information. The gigs had leaned to their right, but Hunter and I pulled it straight in the direction of the stockade upon the chart. The 2 who were left guarding their boats seemed to bustle at our appearance. Lully-Bolero stopped off, and I could see the pair discussing what they ought to do. Had they gone and told Silver, all might have turned out differently, but they had their orders, I suppose, and decided to sit quietly where they were and hark back again to Lully-Bolero. There was a slight bend in the coast, and I steered so as to put it between us. Even before we landed, we had thus lost sight of the gigs. I jumped out and came as near running as I durst, with a big silk handkerchief under my hat for coolness' sake, and a brace of pistols ready primed for safety. I had not gone 100 yards when I reached the stockade. This was how it was. A spring of clear water rose almost at the top of the knoll, well, on the knoll, and enclosing the spring. They had clapped a stout log house fit to hold 200 of people on a pinch, and loopholed for musketry on either side. All round this they had cleared a wide space, and then the thing was completed by a paling 6 feet high, without door or opening, too strong to pull down without time and labour, and too open to shelter the besiegers. The people in the log house had them in every way. They stood quiet in shelter, and shot the others like partridges. All they wanted was good watch and food, for short of a complete surprise, they might have held the place against a regiment. What particularly took my fancy was the spring, for though we had a good enough place of it in the cabin of the Hispaniola, with plenty of arms and ammunition, and things to eat, and excellent wines, there had been one thing overlooked. We had no water. I was thinking this over when there came a ringing over the island, the cry of a man at the point of death. I was not new to violent death. I have served His Royal Highness the Duke of Cumberland, and got a wound myself at Fontenoy, but I know my pulse went dot and carry one. Jim Hawkins is gone, was my first thought. It is something to have been an old soldier, but more still to have been a doctor. There is no time to dilly-dally in our work, and so now I made up my mind instantly, and with no time lost returned to the shore and jumped on board the jolly boat. By good fortune, Hunter pulled a good oar, and we made the water fly, and the boat was soon alongside and aboard the schooner. I found them all shaken, as was natural. The squire was sitting down as white as a sheet, thinking of the harm he had led us to, the good soul. One of the 6 forecastle hands was little better. There's a man, says Captain Smollett, nodding towards him, new to this work. He came nigh hand, fainting, doctor, when he heard the cry. Another touch of the rudder and the man would join us. I told my plan to the captain, and between us we settled on the details of his accomplishment. We put old Redruth in the gallery between the cabin and forecastle, with 3 or 4 loaded muskets and a mattress for protection. Hunter brought the boat round under the stern port, and Joyce and I set to work loading her with powder tins, muskets, bags of biscuits, cakes of pork, a cask of cognac, and my invaluable medicine chest. In the meantime, the squire and the captain stayed on deck, and the latter hailed the coxswain, who was the principal man aboard. "Mr. Hands," he said, "here are 2 of us with a brace of pistols each. If any of you 6 make a signal of any description, that man's dead." They were a good deal taken aback, and after a little consultation, one and all tumbled down the fore companion, thinking no doubt to take us on the rear. But when they saw Redruth waiting for them in the sparred galley, they went about ship at once, and a head popped out again on deck. "Down, dog!" cried the captain. The head popped back again, and we heard no more, for the time, of these 6 very faint-hearted seamen. By this time, tumbling things in as they came, and we had the jolly boat loaded as much as we dared, Joyce and I got out through the stern port, and we made the shore again as fast as our oars would take us. The second trip fairly roused the watchers along the shore, Lily Bolero was dropped again, and just before we lost sight of them behind the little point, one of them whipped ashore and disappeared. I had half a mind to change my plan and destroy their boats, but I feared Silver and the others might be close at hand, and all might very well be lost by trying for too much. We had soon touched land in the same place as before, and set to provision on the blockhouse. All three made their first journey heavily laden and tossed our stores over the palisade. Then, leaving Joyce to guard them, one man to be sure, but with half a dozen muskets, Hunter and I returned to the jolly boat and loaded ourselves once more. We proceeded without pausing to take breath till the whole cargo was bestowed, when the two servants took up their position in the blockhouse, and I, with all my power, scullied back to the Hispaniola. That we should have risked a second boatload seems more daring than it really was. They had the advantage of numbers, of course, but we had the advantage of arms. Not one of the men ashore had a musket, and before they could get within range for pistol shooting, we flattered ourselves that we should be able to give a good account of a half dozen at least. The squire was waiting for me at the stern window, all his faintness gone from him. He caught the painter and made it fast, and we fell to loading the boat for our very lives. Pork, powder, and biscuit was the cargo, with only a musket and a cutlass apiece for the squire and me, and Redruth and the captain. The rest of the arms and powder we dropped overboard in 2 fathoms and a half of water, so that we could see the bright steel shining far below us in the sun on the clean sandy bottom. By this time the tide was beginning to ebb, and the ship was swinging round to her anchor. Voices were heard faintly hallooing in the distance of the 2 gigs, and though this reassured us for Joyce and Hunter, who were well to the eastward, it warned our party to be off. Redruth retreated from his place in the cabin and dropped into the boat, which we then brought round the ship's corner to be handy for Captain Smollett. "Now, men," said he, "do you hear me?" There was no answer from the forecastle. "It's to you, Abraham Gray. It's to you I am speaking." Still no reply. "Gray," resumed Mr. Smollett a little louder, "I am leaving the ship, and I order you to follow your captain. I know you are a good man at bottom, and I dare say not one of the lot of you's as bad as he makes out. I have my watch here in my hand. I give you 30 seconds to join me in." There was a pause. "Come, my fine fellow," continued the captain, "don't hang so long in stays. I'm risking my life and the lives of these good gentlemen every second." There was a sudden scuffle, a sound of blows, and out burst Abraham Gray with a knife cut on the side of his cheek, and came running to the captain like a dog to the whistle. "I'm with you, sir," said he. And the next moment he and the captain had dropped aboard of us. We had shoved off and given way. We were clear out of the ship, but not yet ashore in our stockade. Chapter 17. Narrative continued by the Doctor. The jolly boat's last trip. This 5th trip was quite different from any of the others. In the first place, the little gallipot of the boat and we were in was gravely overloaded. 5 grown men, and 3 of them, Trelawney, Redruth, and the captain, over 6 feet high, was already more than she was meant to carry. Add to that the powder, pork, and bread bags. The gunwale was lipping astern. Several times we shipped a little water, and my breeches and the tail of my coat were all soaking wet when we got 100 yards. The captain made us trim the boat. We got her to lie a little more evenly. All the same, we were afraid to breathe. In the second place, the ebb was now making a strong rippling current running westward through the basin, and then southward and seaward down the strait by which we had entered in the morning. Even the ripples were a danger to our overloaded craft. But the worst of it was that we were swept out of our true course and away from our proper landing place behind the port. If we let the current have its way, we should have come ashore beside the gigs, where the pirates might appear at any moment. "I cannot keep her head for the stockade, sir," said I to the captain. I was steering, while he and Redruth, the 2 fresh men, were at the oars. "The tide keeps washing her down. Could you pull a little stronger?" "Not without swamping the boat," said he. "You must bear up, sir, if you please. Bear up until you see you're gaining." I tried, and found by experiment that the tide kept sweeping us westward until I had laid her head due east, or just about right angles to the way we ought to go. "We'll never get ashore at this rate," said I. "If it's the only course that we can lie, sir, we must even lie it," returned the captain. We must keep upstream. You see, sir, he went on, if once we drop to leeward on the sailing place, it's hard to say where we should get ashore. Besides, the chance of being boarded by the gigs, whereas the way we go, the current must slacken, and then we can dodge back along the shore. The current's less already, sir, said the man Grey, who was sitting in the foresheets. You can ease her off a bit. Thank you, my man, said I, quite as if nothing had happened, for we had all quietly made up our minds to treat him like one of ourselves. Suddenly, the captain spoke up again, and I thought his voice was a little changed. The gun, said he. I have thought of that, said I, for I made sure he was thinking of a bombardment of the fort. They could never get the gun ashore, and if they did, they could never haul it through the woods. Look astern, Doctor, replied the captain. We had entirely forgotten the Long Nine, and there, to our horror, were the 5 rogues busy about her, getting off her jacket, as they called the stout tarpaulin cover under which she sailed. Not only that, but it flashed into my mind at the same moment that the round shot and the powder for the gun had been left behind, and a stroke with an axe would put it all in the possession of the evil ones aboard. Israel was Flint's gunner, said Grey hoarsely. At any risk, we put the boat's head direct for the landing place. By this time we had got so far out of the run of the current that we kept steerage way, even at our necessarily gentle rate of rowing, and I could keep her steady for the goal. But the worst of it was that we had the course I now held. We turned our broadside instead of our stern to the Hispaniola, and offered a target like a barn door. I could hear as well as see that brandy-faced rascal Israel Hand plumping down the round shot on the deck. Who's the best shot? Asked the captain. Mr. Trelawney, out and away, said I. Mr. Trelawney, will you please pick me off one of these men, sir? Hands, if possible, said the captain. Trelawney was cool as steel. He looked to the priming of his gun. Now, cried the captain, easy with that gun, sir, or you'll swamp the boat. All hands stand by to trim her when he aims. The squire raised his gun, the rowing ceased, and we leaned over to the other side to keep the balance, and all was so nicely contrived that we did not ship a drop. They had the gun by this time, slewed round upon the swivel, and Hans, who was at the muzzle with the rammer, was in consequence the most exposed. However, we had no luck, for just as Trelawney fired, down he stooped, the ball whistled over him, and it was one of the other 4 who fell. The cry he gave was echoed not only by his companions on board, but by a great number of voices from the shore, and looking in that direction I saw the other pirates trooping out from among the trees and tumbling into their places in the boats. Here come the gigs, sir, said I. Give way then, cried the captain. We mustn't mind if we swamp her now. If we can't get ashore, all's up. Only one of the gigs is being manned, sir, I added. The crew of the other one likely going round by shore to cut us off. We'll have a hot run, sir, returned the captain. Jack ashore, you know. It's not them I mind, it's the round shot. Carpet bowls. My lady's maid couldn't miss. Tell us, squire, when you see the match, and we'll hold water. In the meantime, we'd been making headway at a good pace for a boat so overloaded, and we had shipped but little water in the process. We were now close in, 30 or 40 strokes, and we should reach the beach her, for the ebb had already disclosed a narrow belt of sand below the clustering trees. The gig was no longer to be feared. The little point had already concealed it from our eyes. The ebb tide, which had so cruelly delayed us, was now making reparation and delaying our assailants. The one source of danger was the gun. If I durst, said the captain, I'd stop and pick off another man, but it was plain that they meant nothing should delay the shot. They had never so much as looked at their fallen comrade, though he was not dead, and I could see him trying to crawl away. Ready, cried the squire. Hold, cried the captain, quick as an echo, and he and Redruth backed with a great heave that sent her stern bodily under water. The report fell at the same instant of time. This was the first that Jim heard, the sound of the squire's shot not having reached him. Where the ball passed, not one of us precisely knew, but I fancy it must have been over our heads, and that the wind of it may have contributed to our disaster. At any rate, the boat sank by the stern, quite gently, in 3 feet of water, leaving the captain and myself facing each other on our feet. The other 3 took complete headers and came up again drenched and bubbling. So far there was no great harm, no lives were lost, and we could wade ashore in safety. But there were all our stores at the bottom, and to make things worse, only 2 guns out of the 5 remained in a state for service. Mine I had snatched from my knees and held over my head by a sort of instinct. And as for the captain, he had carried his over his shoulder by a bandolier, and like a wise man, Locke uppermost. The other 3 had gone down with the boat. To add to our concern, we heard voices already drawing near us in the woods along shore, and we had not only the danger of being cut off from the stockade in our half-crippled state, but the fear before us whether, if Hunter and Joyce were attacked by half a dozen, they would have the sense and conduct to stand firm. Hunter was steady, that we knew. Joyce was a doubtful case, a pleasant, violent man for a valet and to brush one's clothes, but not entirely fitted for a man of war. With all this in our minds, we waded ashore as fast as we could, leaving behind us the poor jolly boat and a good half of all our powder and provisions. Chapter 18. Narrative continued by the Doctor. End of our first day's fighting. We made our best speed across the strip of wood that now divided us from the stockade, and at every step we took the voices of the buccaneers rang nearer. Soon we could hear their footfalls as they ran, and the cracking of the branches as they breasted across a bit of thicket. I began to see we should have a brush for it in earnest, and looked to my priming. "Captain," said I, "Trelawney is the dead shot. Give him your gun. His own is useless." They exchanged guns, and Trelawney, silent and cool as he had been since the beginning of the bustle, hung a moment on his heel to see if it was all fit for service. At the same time, observing Grey to be unarmed, I handed him my cutlass. It did all our hearts good to see him spit in his hand, knit his brows, and make the blade sing through the air. It was plain from every line of his body that our new hand was worth his salt. 40 paces farther we came to the edge of the wood and saw the stockade in front of us. We struck the enclosure about the middle of the south side, and almost at the same time 7 mutineers, Joel Anderson, the boatswain, at their head, appeared in full cry at the southwestern corner. They paused as if taken aback, and before they recovered, not only the squire and I, but Hunter and Joyce from the blockhouse had time to fire. The 4 shots came in rather a scattering volley, but they did the business. One of the enemy actually fell, and the rest, without hesitation, turned and plunged into the trees. After reloading, we walked down the outside of the palisade to see the fallen enemy, who was stone dead, shot through the heart. We began to rejoice over our good success, when just at the moment a pistol cracked in the bush, a ball whistled close past my ear, and poor Tom Redruth stumbled and fell his length on the ground. Both the squire and I returned the shot, but as we had nothing to aim at, it is probable we only wasted powder. Then we reloaded and turned our attention to poor Tom. The captain and Grey were already examining him, and I saw with half an eye that all was over. I believe the readiness of our return volley had scattered the mutineers once more, for we were suffered without further molestation to get the poor old gamekeeper hoisted over the stockade and carried, groaning and bleeding, into the log-house. Poor old fellow! He had not uttered one word of surprise, complaint, fear, or even acquiescence from the very beginning of our troubles till now, when we had laid him down in the log-house to die. He had lain like a Trojan behind his mattress in the galley. He had followed every order silently, doggedly, and well. He was the oldest of our party by a score of years, and now, sullen, old, serviceable servant, it was he that was to die. The squire dropped down beside him on his knees and kissed his hand, crying like a child. "Be I going, doctor?" he asked. "Tom, my man," said I, "you're going home." "I wish I had a lick at them with the gun first," he replied. "Tom," said the squire, "say you forgive me, won't you?" "Would that be respectful like, from me to you, squire?" was the answer. "Howsoever, so be it. Amen." After a little while of silence, he said he thought somebody might read a prayer. "It's the custom, sir," he added apologetically. Not long after, without another word, he passed away. In the meantime, the captain, who I had observed to be wonderfully swollen about the chest and pockets, had turned out a great many various stores, the British colours, a Bible, a coil of stoutish rope, pen, ink, the logbook, a pound of tobacco. He had found a longish fir tree lying felled and trimmed in the enclosure, and with the help of Hunter, he had set it up at the corner of the log house where the trunks crossed and made an angle. Then climbed on the roof. He had with his own hand bent and run up the colours. This seemed mightily to relieve him. He re-entered the log-house and set about counting up the stores as if nothing else existed. But he had an eye on Tom's packet, Sidge for all that, and as soon as all was over, came forward with another flag and reverently spread it on the body. "Don't you take on, sir," he said, shaking the squire's hand. "All's well with him. No fear for a hand that's been shot down in his duty to captain and owner. It mayn't be good divinity, but it's a fact." Then he pulled me aside. "Dr. Livesey," he said, "how many weeks do you and Squire expect the consort?" I told him it was a question not of weeks but of months, that if we were not back by the end of August, Blandley was to send to find us, but neither sooner nor later. "You can calculate for yourself," I said. "Why, yes," returned the captain, scratching his head, "and making a large allowance, sir, for all the gifts of Providence, I should say we're pretty close hauled." "How do you mean?" I asked. "It's a pity, sir, we lost the second load, that's what I mean," replied the captain. "As for the powder and shot, will do, but the rations are short, very short. So short, Dr. Livesey, that perhaps as well without that extra month." And he pointed to the dead body under the flag. Just then, with a roar and a whistle, a round shot passed high above the roof of the longhouse and plumped far beyond us in the wood. "Oh ho," said the captain, "blaze away. You've little enough powder already, my lads." At the second trial, the aim was better, and the ball descended inside the stockade, scattering a cloud of sand, but doing no further damage. "Captain," said the squire, "the house is quite invisible from the ship. It must be the flag they are aiming at. Would it not be wiser to take it in?" "Strike my colours?" cried the captain. "No, sir, not I." And as soon as he had said the words, I think we all agreed with him, for it was not only a piece of stout, seemingly good feeling, it was good policy besides, and showed our enemies that we despise their cannonade. All through the evening they kept thundering away. Ball after ball flew over or fell short or kicked up the sand in the enclosure. But they had to fire so high that the shot fell dead and buried itself in the soft sand. We had no ricochet to fear, and though one popped in through the roof of the longhouse and out again up through the floor, we soon got used to this sort of horseplay and minded it no more than cricket. "There is one good thing about all this," observed the captain. "The wood in front of us is likely clear. The ebb has made a good while that our stores should be uncovered. Volunteers to go and bring in pork." Gray and Hunter were the first to come forward. Well armed, they stole out of the stockade, but it proved a useless mission. The mutineers were bolder than we fancied, or they put more trust in Israel's gunnery. For 4 or 5 of them were busy carrying off our stores and wading out with them to one of the gigs that lay close by, pulling an oar or so to hold it steady against the current. Silver was in the stern sheets in command, and every man of them was now provided with a musket from some secret magazine of their own. The captain sat down to his log, and here is the beginning of the entry. Alexander Smollett, master; David Livesey, ship's doctor; Abraham Gray, carpenter's mate; John Trelawney, owner; John Hunter and Richard Joyce, owner's servants; landsmen, being all that is left faithful of the ship's company, with stores for 10 days at short rations, came ashore this day and flew British colours on the loghouse in Treasure Island. Thomas Redruth, owner's servant, landsman, shot by routineers; James Hawkins, cabin boy. And at the same time I was wondering over Jim Hawkins' fate. A hail on the land side. "Somebody hailing us?" said Hunter, who was on guard. "Doctor, Squire, Captain, hello! Hunter, is that you?" came the cries, and I ran to the door in time to see Jim Hawkins, safe and sound, coming climbing over the stockade. Chapter 19. Narrative resumed by Jim Hawkins, the garrison in the stockade. As soon as Ben Gunn saw the colours, he came to a halt, stopped me by the arm, and sat down. "Now," said he, "there's your friends, sure enough." "Far more likely it's the mutineers," I answered. "That," he cried. "Why, in a place like this, where nobody puts in but gentlemen of fortune, Silver would fly the Jolly Roger, and don't you make no doubt of it. No, that's your friends. There's been blows too. I reckon your friends has had the best of it. And here they are ashore in the old stockade, as was made years and years ago by Flint. Ah, he was the man to have a headpiece, was Flint. Barring rum, his match was never seen. He was afraid of none, not he, only Silver. Silver was that genteel." "Well," said I, "that may be so, and so be it. All the more reason I should hurry on and join my friends." "Nay, mate," returned Ben, "not you. You're a good boy, or I mistook, but you're only a boy, all told. Now, Ben Gunn is fly. Rum wouldn't bring me there where you're going, not rum wouldn't, till I see you're born gentleman and gets it on his word of honour. and you wouldn't forget my words. A precious sight, that's what you'll say. A precious sight, more confidence, and then nips him. And he pinched me the third time with the same air of cleverness. And when Ben Gunn is wanted, you know where to find him, Jim. Just where you found him today. Him that comes is to have a white thing in his hand, and here's to come alone. Oh, and you'll say this, Ben Gunn, says you, has reasons of his own. Well, said I believe I understand. You have something to propose, and you wish to see the squire or the doctor, and you're to be found where I found you. Is that all? And when, says you, he added. Why, from about noon observation to about 6 bells. Good, said I. And now may I go? You won't forget, he inquired anxiously. Precious sight and reasons of his own, says you. Reasons of his own, that's the mainstay as between man and man. Well then, still holding me. I reckon you can go, Jim. And Jim, if you was to see silver, you wouldn't go for to sell, Ben Gunn. Wild horses wouldn't draw it from you. No, says you. And if them pirates camp ashore, Jim, what would you say but they'd be widows in the morning? Here he was interrupted by a loud report and a cannonball coming tearing through the trees and pitching in the sand not 100 yards from where we two were talking. The next moment each of us had taken to his heels in a different direction. For a good hour to come frequent reports shook the island, and balls kept crashing through the woods. I moved from hiding place to hiding place, always pursued, or so it seemed to me, by those terrifying missiles. But towards the end of the bombardment, though I still durst not venture in the direction of the stockade where the balls fell oftenest, I had begun in a manner to pluck up my heart again, and after a long detour to the east, crept down among the shore-side trees. The sun had just set, the sea breeze was rustling and tumbling in the woods, and ruffling the grey surface of the anchorage. The tide, too, was far out, and great tracts of sand lay uncovered. The air, after the heat of the day, chilled me through my jacket. The Hispaniola still lay where she had been anchored, but sure enough there was the Jolly Roger, the black flag of piracy, flying from her peak. Even as I looked, there came another red flash and another report that sent echoes clattering, and one more round shot whistled through the air. It was the last of the cannonade. I lay for some time watching the bustle which succeeded the attack. Men were demolishing something with axes on the beach near the stockade, the poor jolly boat I afterwards discovered. Away near the mouth of the river, a great fire was glowing among the trees, and between that point and the ship one of the gigs kept coming and going, the men, whom I had seen so gloomy, shouting at the oars like children, but there was a sound in their voices that suggested rum. At the length I thought I might return towards the stockade. I was pretty far down on the low, sandy spit that encloses the anchorage to the east, and is joined at half water to Skeleton Island. And now, as I rose to my feet, I saw some distance further down the spit, and rising from among low bushes and isolated rock, pretty high, and peculiarly white in colour. It occurred to me that this might be the white rock of which Ben Gunn had spoken, and that some day or other a boat might be wanted and I should know where to look for one. Then I skirted among the woods until I had regained the rear or shoreward side of the stockade, and that was soon warmly welcomed by the faithful party. I'd soon told my story and began to look about me. The log house was made of unsquared trunks of pine, roof, walls, and floor. The latter stood in several places as much as a foot or a foot and a half above the surface of the sand. There was a porch at the door, and under the porch was a little spring welled up into an artificial basin of a rather odd kind, no other than a great ship's kettle of iron with the bottom knocked out and sunk to her bearings, as the captain among the others had said. Little had been left beside the framework of the house, but in one corner there was a stone slab laid down by way of a hearth and an old rusty iron bucket to contain the fire. The slopes of the knoll and all inside the stockade had been cleared of timber to build the house, and we could see by the stumps what a fine and lofty grove had been destroyed. Most of the soil had been washed away or buried in drift after the removal of the trees. Only where the streamlet ran from the kettle and a thick bed of moss and some ferns and little creeping bushes that were still green among the sand. Very close around the stockade, too close for defence, they said. The woods still flourished high and dense, all of fir on the land side, but towards the sea with a large admixture of live oaks. The cold evening breeze of which I have spoken whistled through every chink of the rude building and sprinkled the floor with a continual rain of fine sand. There was sand in our eyes, sand in our teeth, sand in our suppers, sand dancing in the spring at the bottom of the kettle, all the world like porridge beginning to boil. Our chimney was a square hole in the roof. It was but a little part of the smoke that found its way out, and the rest eddied about the house and kept us coughing and piping the eye. Add to this that Gray, the new man, had his face tied up in a bandage for a cut he had got in breaking away from the mutineers, and the poor old Tom Redruth, still unburied, lay along the wall, stiff and stark under the Union Jack. If we had been allowed to sit idle, we should have fallen in the blues, but Captain Smollett was never the man for that. All hands were called up before him, and he divided us into watches. The doctor and Gray and I for one, the squire, Hunter and Joyce upon the other. Tired though we all were, 2 were sent out for firewood, 2 more were sent to dig a grave for Redruth. The doctor was named Cook. I was put sentry at the door, and the captain himself went from one to another, keeping up our spirits and lending a hand wherever it was wanted. From time to time the doctor came to the door for a little air and to rest his eyes, which were almost smoked out of his head, and whenever he did so, he had a word for me. "That man Smollett," he said once, "is a better man than I am. And when I say that means a deal, Jim." Another time he came and was silent for a while, then he put his head on one side and looked at me. "Is this Ben Gunn a man?" he asked. "I do not know, sir," said I. "I'm very sure whether he's sane." "And if there's any doubt about the matter, he is," returned the doctor. "A man who has been 3 years biting his nails on a desert island, Jim, can't expect to appear as sane as you and me. Doesn't lie in human nature. Was it cheese you said he had a fancy for?" "Yes, sir, cheese," I answered. "Well, Jim," says he, "just see the good that comes of being dainty in your food. You've seen my snuff box, haven't you? And you never saw me take snuff, for reasons being that in my snuff box I carry a piece of Parmesan cheese, a cheese made in Italy, very nutritious. Well, that's for Ben Gunn." Before supper was eaten, we buried old Tom in the sand and stood round him for a while, bare-headed in the breeze. A good deal of firewood had been got in, but not enough for the captain's fancy, and he shook his head over it and told us we must get back to this tomorrow rather livelier. Then when we had eaten our pork and each of us had a good stiff glass of brandy grog, the 3 chefs got together in a corner to discuss our prospects. It appears they were at their wits' end what to do, the stores being so low that we must have been starved into surrender long before help came. But our best hope, it was decided, was to kill off the buccaneers until they'd either hauled down their flag or run away with the Hispaniola. From 19 they were already reduced to 15, 2 others were wounded, and one at least, the man shot beside the gun, severely wounded if he were not dead. Every time we had a crack at them, we were to take it, saving our own lives with the extremest care, and besides that we had 2 able allies, rum and the climate. As for the first, we thought we were half a mile away. We could hear them roaring and singing late into the night. And as for the second, the doctor staked his wig that, camped were they in the marsh and unprovided with remedies, the half of them would be on their backs before a week. "So," he added, "if we are not all shot down first, they'll be glad to be packing in the schooner. It's always a ship, and they can get to buccaneering again, I suppose." "The first ship that I ever lost," said Captain Smollett. "I was dead tired, as you may fancy, and when I got to sleep, which was not till after a great deal of tossing, I slept like a log of wood." The rest had long been up, and already breakfasted and increased the pile of firewood by about half as much again when I was wakened by a bustle and the sound of voices. "Flag of truce," I heard someone say, and then immediately after, with a cry of surprise, "Silver himself!" And at that up I jumped, and rubbing my eyes, ran to a loophole in the wall. Chapter 20. Silver's Embassy. Sure enough, there were 2 men just outside the stockade, one of them waving a white cloth, the other, no less a person than Silver himself, standing placidly by. It was still quite early, and the coldest morning that I think I was ever aboard. A chill that pierced into the marrow. The sky was bright and cloudless overhead, and the tops of the trees shone rosily in the sun, but where Silver stood, with his lieutenant, all was still in shadow, and they waded knee-deep in a low white vapour that had crawled during the night out of the morass. The chill and the vapour taken together told a poor tale of the island. It was plainly a damp, feverish, unhealthy spot. "Keep indoors, men," said the captain. 10 to 1, this is a trick. Then he hailed the buccaneer. "Who goes? Stand, or we fire." Flag of truce, cried Silver. The captain was in the porch, keeping himself carefully out of the way of a treacherous shot should any be intended. He turned and spoke to us. Doctor's watch on the lookout. Dr. Livesey, take the north side, if you please. Jim the east, Grey west. Then watch below. All hands to load muskets. Lively, men, and be careful. And then he turned again to the mutineers. And what do you want with your flag of truce? He cried. This time it was the other men who replied. Captain Silver, sir, to come on board and make terms, he shouted. Captain Silver? Don't know him. Who's he? Cried the captain. We could hear him adding to himself. Captain, is it? My heart, and here's promotion. Long John answered for himself. Me, sir. These poor lads have chosen me captain after your desertion, sir, laying a particular emphasis upon the word desertion. We're willing to submit if we can come to terms and no bones about it. All I ask is your word, Captain Smollett, to let me safe and sound out of this here stockade, and 1 minute to get out a shot before gun is fired. My man, said Captain Smollett, I've not the slightest desire to talk to you. If you wish to talk to me, you can come, that's all. If there's any treachery, it'll be on your side, and the Lord help you. That's enough, Captain, shouted Long John cheerily. A word from you's enough. I know a gentleman, and you may lay to that. We could see the man who carried the flag of truce attempting to hold Silver back. Nor was that wonderful, seeing how cavalier had been the captain's answer, but Silver laughed at him aloud and slapped him on the back as if the idea of alarm had been absurd. Then he advanced to the stockade, flew over his crutch, got a leg up, and with great vigour and skill succeeded in surmounting the fence and dropping safely to the other side. I will confess that I was far too much taken up with what was going on to be of the slightest use as a sentry. Indeed, I had already deserted my eastern loophole and crept up beside the captain, who had now seated himself on the threshold with his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, and his eyes fixed on the water as it bubbled out of the old iron kettle in the sand. He was whistling, "Come, lasses and lads." Silver had terrible hard work getting up the knoll. What with the steepness of the incline, the thick tree stumps, and the soft sand, he and his crutch were as helpless as the ship in stays. But he stuck to it like a man in silence, and at last arrived before the captain, whom he saluted in the handsomest style. He was tricked out in his best, an immense blue coat, thick with brass buttons, hung as low as to his knees, and a fine lace hat was set on the back of his head. "Here you are, my man," said the captain, raising his head. "You had better sit down." "You ain't going to let me inside, Captain," complained Long John. "It's a main cold morning, to be sure, sir, to sit outside upon the sand." "Why, Silver," said the captain, if you had pleased to be an honest man, you might have been sitting in your galley. It's your own doing. You're either my ship's cook, and then you were treated handsome, or Captain Silver, common mutineer and pirate, and then you can go hang. "Well, well, Captain," returned the sea cook, sitting down as if bidden on the sand, "you'll have to give me a hand up again, that's all. A sweet pretty place you have on here. Ah, there's Jim. The top of the morning to you, Jim. Doctor, here's my service. Why, there you all are together like a happy family, in a manner of speaking. If you have anything to say, my man, better say it," said the captain. "Right you were, Captain Smollett," replied Silver. "Duty is duty, to be sure. Well, now, you look here. That was a good lay of yours last night, and don't deny it was a good lay. Some of you pretty handy with a handspike end, and I'll not deny neither what was some of my people was shook. Maybe all was shook. Maybe I was shook myself. Maybe that's why I'm here for terms. But you mark me, Captain, it won't do me twice, by thunder. You'll have to do sentry go and ease off a point or two on the rum. Maybe you'll think we were all a sheet in the wind's eye, but I'll tell you I was sober. I was only dog-tired, and if I'd awoke a second sooner, I'd have caught you in the act, I would. He wasn't dead when I got round to him, not he." "Well," said Captain Smollett, as cool as can be. All that Silver said was a riddle to him, but you would never have guessed it from his tone. As for me, I began to have an inkling. Ben Gunn's last words came back to my mind. I began to suppose that he had paid the buccaneers a visit while they all lay drunk together round the fire, and reckoned up with glee that we'd only 14 enemies to deal with. "Well, here it is," said Silver. "We want that treasure, and we'll have it. That's our point. You would just as soon save your lives, I reckon, and that's yours. You have a chart, haven't you?" "That's as may be," replied the captain. "Oh, well, you have, I know that," returned Long John. "You needn't be so husky with a man. There ain't a particle of service in that. You may lay to it. What I mean is, we want your chart. Now, I never meant you harm myself. That won't do with me, my man, interrupted the captain. We know exactly what you meant to do, and we don't care for now, you see. You can't do it. And the captain looked at him calmly and proceeded to fill a pipe. If Abe Gray, Silver broke out. Avast there, cried Mr. Smollett. Gray told me nothing. I asked him nothing, and what's more, I would see you and him and this whole island blown clean out of the water into blazes first. So there's my mind for you, my man, on that. The little whiff of temper seemed to cool Silver down. He'd been growing nettled before, but now he pulled himself together. Like enough, said he, I would set no limits to what gentlemen might consider shipshape, or might not, as the case were. And seeing as how you're about to take a pipe, Captain, I make so free as to do likewise. And he filled a pipe and lighted it, and the two men sat silently smoking for quite a while, now looking each other in the face, now stopping their tobacco, now leaning forward to spit. It was as good as the play to see them. Now, resumed Silver, here it is. You give us this chart to get the treasure by, and drop shooting poor seamen and stoving of their heads in while asleep. You do that, we'll offer you a choice. Either you come aboard along of us once the treasure's shipped, and I'll give you my Affy-Daffy upon my word of honour to clap you somewhere safe ashore. Or if that ain't to your fancy, some of the hands being rough and having old scores on account of hazing, you can stay here, you can. We'll divide stores with you, man for man. I'll give you my Affy-Daffy, as before to speak, the first ship I sight, and send 'em here to pick you up. Now you'll own that's talking. Handsomer you couldn't look to get, now you, I hope, raising his voice, that all hands in this here blockhouse will overhaul my words, for what is spoke to one is spoke to all. Captain Smollett rose from his seat and knocked out the ashes of his pipe in the palm of his left hand. Is that all? He asked. Every last word, by thunder, answered John. Refuse that, and you've seen the last of me but musket balls. Very good, said the captain. Now you'll hear from me. If you'll come up one by one, unarmed, I'll engage to clap you all in irons and take you home to a fair trial in England. If you won't, my name is Alexander Smollett. I've flown my sovereign's colours, and I'll see you all to Davy Jones. You can't find the treasure. You can't sail the ship. There's not a man among you fit to sail the ship. You can't fight us. Gray there got away from 5 of you. Your ship's in irons, Master Silver. You're on a lee shore, and so you'll find. I stand here and tell you, and they're the last good words you'll get from me, for, in the name of heaven, I'll put a bullet in your back when next I meet you. Tramp, my lad. Bundle out of this, please, hand over hand, and double quick. Silver's face was a picture. His eyes started in his head with wrath. He shook the fire out of his pipe. Give me a hand up, he cried. Not I, returned the captain. Who'll give me a hand up? He roared. Not a man among us moved. Growling the foulest imprecations, he crawled along the sand till he got hold of the porch and could hoist himself again upon his crutch. Then he spat into the spring. There, he cried. That's what I think of ye. Before an hour's out, I'll stove your old blockhouse like a rum punch, and laugh, by thunder, laugh. Before an hour's out, you'll laugh on the other side. Then the die'll be the lucky ones. With a dreadful oath, he stumbled off, ploughing down the sand, was helpless across the stockade after 4 or 5 failures by a man with a flag of truce, and disappeared in an instant afterwards among the trees. Chapter 21. The Attack. As soon as Silver disappeared, the captain, who had been closely watching him, turned towards the interior of the house and found not a man of us at his post but Gray. It was the first time we'd ever seen him angry. Quarters, he roared, and then we all slunk back to our places. Gray, he said, I'll put your name in the log. You've stood by your duty like a seaman. Mr. Trelawney, I'm surprised at you, Sir Doctor. I thought you had worn the king's coat. If that's how you survived at Fontenoy, sir, you'd have done better in your berth. The doctor's watch were all back at their loopholes. The rest were busy loading the spare muskets, and everyone with a red face, you may be certain, and a flea in his ear, as the saying is. The captain looked on for a while in silence. Then he spoke. My lads, said he, I have given Silver a broadside. I pitched it in red hot on purpose, and before the hour's out, as he said, we shall be boarded. We're outnumbered. I needn't tell you that, but we fight in shelter, and a minute ago I should have said we fought with discipline. I've no manner of doubt that we can drub them, if you choose. Then he went the rounds and saw, as he said, that all was clear. On the two short sides of the house, east and west, there were only two loopholes. On the south side were the porches, two again, and on the north side, five. There was a round score of muskets for the 7 of us. The firewood had been built into 4 piles, tables, you might say, one about the middle of each side, and on each of those tables some ammunition and 4 loaded muskets were laid ready for the hand of the defenders. In the middle, cutlasses lay ranged. "Toss out the fire," said the captain. "The chill is past, and we mustn't have smoke in our eyes." The iron fire basket was carried bodily out by Mr. Trelawney, and the embers smothered amongst the sand. "Hawkins hasn't had his breakfast. Hawkins, help yourself, and back to your post to eat it," continued Captain Smollett. "Beverley now, my lad, you want it before you're done. Hunter, serve out a round of brandy for all hands." And while this was going on, the captain completed in his own mind a plan of defence. "Doctor, you will take the door," he resumed. "See, and don't expose yourself. Keep within and fire through the porch. Hunter, take the east side. There. Joyce, you stand by the west, my man. Mr. Trelawney, you are the best shot. You and Gray will take the long north side with the 5 loopholes. It's there the danger is. If they can get up to it and fire in upon us from our own ports, things will begin to look dirty. Hawkins, neither you nor I are much account at the shooting. We'll stand by to load and bear a hand." As the captain had said, the chill was past. As soon as the sun had climbed above our girdle of trees, it fell with all its force upon the clearing and drank up the vapours at a draught. Soon the sand was baking, and the resin melting in the logs of the blockhouse. Jackets and coats were flung aside, shirts thrown open at the neck and rolled up to the shoulders, and we were stood there, each at his post, in a fever of heat and anxiety. An hour passed away. "Hang them," said the captain. "This is as dull as the doldrums. Gray, whistle for a wind." And just at that moment came the first news of the attack. "If you please, sir," said Joyce, "if I see anyone am I to fire?" "I told you so," cried the captain. "Thank you, sir," returned Joyce with the same quiet civility. Nothing followed for a time. The remark had set all on alert, straining ears and eyes. The musketeers with their pieces balanced in their hand, the captain out in the middle of the blockhouse with his mouth very tight and a frown on his face. So some seconds passed, till suddenly Joyce whipped up his musket and fired. The reporters scarcely died away ere it was repeated and repeated from without in a scattering volley, shot behind shot, like a string of geese from every side of the enclosure. Several bullets struck the log house, but not one entered, and as the smoke cleared away and vanished, the stockade and the woods about it looked as quiet and empty as before. Not a bough waved, not this gleam of musket barrel betrayed the presence of our foes. "Did you hit your man?" asked the captain. "No, sir," replied Joyce. "I believe not, sir." "Next best thing to tell the truth," muttered Captain Smollett. "Load his gun, Hawkins. How many should say were on your side, Doctor?" "I know precisely," said Dr. Livesey. 3 shots were fired on this side. I saw 3 flashes, 2 close together, 1 farther to the west. 3, repeated the captain. "And how many on yours, Mr. Trelawney?" But this was not so easily answered. There had come many from the north, 7 by the squire's computation, 8 or 9 according to Gray. From east and west only a single shot had been fired. It was plain, therefore, the attack would be developed from the north, and there would be on the other 3 sides. We were only to be annoyed by a show of hostilities. But Captain Smollett made no change in his arrangements. If the mutineers succeeded in crossing the stockade, he argued, they would take possession of any unprotected loopholes and shoot us down like rats in our own stronghold. Nor had we much time left for us for thought. Suddenly, with a loud huzzah, a little cloud of pirates leapt from the woods on the north side and ran straight on the stockade. At the same moment, the fire was once more opened from the woods, and a rifle ball sang through the doorway and knocked the doctor's musket into bits. The boarders swarmed over the fence like monkeys. Squire and Gray fired again, and yet again. 3 men fell, 1 towards the enclosure, 2 back on the outside, but of these 1 was evidently more frightened than hurt, for he was on his feet again in a crack, and instantly disappeared among the trees. 2 had bit the dust, 1 had fled, 4 had made good with their footing inside our defences, while from the shelter of the woods 7 or 8 men, each evidently supplied with several muskets, kept up a hot though useless fire on the log house. The 4 who had boarded made straight before them for the building, shouting as they ran, and the men among the trees shouted back to encourage them. Several shots were fired, but such was the hurry of the marksmen that not one appeared to have taken effect. In a moment the 4 pirates had swarmed up the mound and were upon us. The head of Job Anderson, the boatswain, appeared in the middle loophole. "At 'em, all hands!" he roared in a voice of thunder. At the same moment, another pirate grasped Hunter's musket by the muzzle, wrenched it from his hands, plucked it through the loophole, and with one stunning blow laid the poor fellow senseless on the floor. Meanwhile, a third, running unharmed all around the house, appeared suddenly in the doorway and fell with his cutlass on the doctor. Our position was utterly reversed. A moment since we were firing under cover at an exposed enemy. Now it was we who lay uncovered and could not return a blow. The log house was full of smoke, to which we owed our comparative safety. Cries and confusion, the flashes and reports of pistol shots, and one loud groan rang in my ears. "Out, lads, out, and fight 'em in the open! Cutlasses!" cried the captain. I snatched a cutlass from the pile, and someone at the same time snatching another gave me a cut across the knuckles which I hardly felt. I dashed out the door into the clear sunlight. Someone was close behind, I knew not whom. Right in front, the doctor was pursuing his assailant down the hill, and just as my eyes fell upon him, beat down his guard and sent him sprawling on his back with a great slash across the face. "Round the house, lads, round the house!" cried the captain, and even in the hurly-burly I perceived a change in his voice. Mechanically I obeyed, turned eastwards, and with my cutlass raised ran around the corner of the house. Next moment I was face to face with Anderson. He roared aloud, with his hanger went up above his head, flashing in the sunlight. I had not time to be afraid, but as the blow still hung impending, leaped in a trice upon one side and missed my foot in the soft sand, rolled headlong down the slope. When I had first sallied from the door, the other mutineers had already been swarming upon the palisade to make an end of us. One man in a red nightcap, with his cutlass in his mouth, had even got aboard the top and thrown a leg across. With so short had been the interval that I had found my feet again, all was the same posture. The fellow with the red cap still halfway over, another still showing his hand upon the top of the stockade, and yet, in this breath of time, the fight was over, and the victory was ours. Gray, following close behind, had cut down the big boatswain ere he had time to recover from his last blow. Another had been shot at the loophole in the very act of firing into the house, and now lay in agony, the pistol still smoking in his hand. A third, as I had seen, the doctor had disposed of at the blow. Of the four who had scaled the palisade, only one remained unaccounted for, and he, having left his cutlass on the field, was now clambering out again with the fear of death upon him. "Fire! Fire from the house!" cried the doctor. "And you, lads, back into cover!" But his words were unheeded. No shot was fired, and the last boarder made good his escape and disappeared with the rest into the wood. In 3 seconds, nothing remained of the attacking party but the 5 who had fallen, 4 on the inside and 1 on the outside side of the palisade. The doctor and Gray and I ran full speed for shelter. The survivors would soon be back, and they had left their muskets, and at any moment the fire might recommence. The house was by this time somewhat cleared of smoke, and we saw at a glance the price we had paid for victory. Hunter lay beside his loophole, stunned. Joyce, by his, shot through the head, never to move again. While right in the centre, the squire was supporting the captain, one as pale as the other. "The captain's wounded," said Mr. Trelawney. "Have they run?" asked Mr. Smollett. "All that could, you may be bound," returned the doctor. "But there's 5 of them will never run again." "5!" cried the captain. "Come, that's better. 5 again leaves us 3. 5 against 3 leaves us 4 to 9. That's better odds than we had at starting. We were 7 to 19 then, or thought we were, and that's as bad as bear." The mutineers were soon only 8 in number, but the man shot by Mr. Trelawney on board the schooner had died that same evening of his wound, but this was, of course, not known till after by the faithful party. And that brings us to the end of part 4. I think we're doing all right. It's 20 to 11. There are 2 parts of this left, part 5 and part 6. I think in the interests of making sure I don't have a late night tomorrow, I think we will push on, but I'm going to take a quick 5-minute break, a quick comfort break, and rest the vocal cords for just a minute, and then we will continue. If you'll happily continue joining us as an audience. I'll say again, it would be amazing if folks could donate to Great Ormond Street Charity. That's why I'm doing this. Just follow the link in the bottom right. Anything you can donate would be absolutely wonderful. We're almost halfway to our goal of £100, and it would be brilliant if we could get even closer to that by the night's end. So I think we'll take 5. I'll stick the music back on. And we'll be back at just after past, I think. All right, I'll see you in a second. Welcome back. Welcome back. If you are just joining us for the first time, or the first time tonight, welcome back. We are currently reading the classic adventure novel Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, doing this in aid of Great Ormond Street Hospital as part of their Oh My Gosh campaign. A little bit of fun I thought this would be to raise money for a charity that is near and dear to my heart. We have a goal of trying to raise £100 this week. We are almost halfway there. We've got £48 out of 100. It would be amazing if we could finish tonight a little close to that. Certainly over the halfway mark would be wonderful. So if you can donate anything, that would be absolutely wonderful. If you can't, I completely understand. Nothing wrong with that. Times are incredibly tough for a lot of people. But if you could donate something, that'd be wonderful. If you can't, a share of the links on social, just whether you're watching this on Twitch or YouTube or both is fine. Please share it with someone else if they want to join us for the rest of this. We'll recommend that someone watch the VODs afterwards and donate afterwards. I believe the campaign will stay open afterwards, even though everything officially ends tomorrow night. Okay, we're going to take a swig of my drink and we're going to get back to the story. Okay. So, there are 6 parts to this story. We've read 4 now. We're going to do 1 more tonight. Leave us just part 6 for tomorrow, assuming my voice holds out. That is a big if, but let's see how we get on. Part 5, My Sea Adventure. Chapter 22, How I Began My Sea Adventure. There was no return of the mutineers, not so much as another shot out of the woods. They had got their rations for that day, as the captain put it, and we had the place to ourselves and a quiet time to overhaul the wounded and get dinner. Squire and I cooked outside in spite of the danger, and even outside we could hardly tell what we were at, the horror for the loud groans that reached us from the doctor's patients. Out of the 8 men who had fallen in the action, only 3 still breathed. That one of the pirates had been shot at the loophole, Hunter and Captain Smollett. And of these, the first 2 were as good as dead. The mutineer indeed died under the doctor's knife, and Hunter, do what we could, never recovered consciousness in this world. He lingered all day, breathing loudly like the old buccaneer at home in his apoplectic fit, but the bones of his chest had been crushed by the blow and his skull fractured in falling, and sometime in the following night, without sign or sound, he went to his Maker. And as for the captain, his wounds were grievous indeed, but not dangerous. No organ was fatally injured. Anderson's ball, for it was Job that shot him first, had broken his shoulder blade and touched the lung, not badly. The second had only torn and displaced some muscles in the calf. He was sure to recover, the doctor said, but in the meantime, and for weeks to come, he must not walk, nor move his arm, nor so much as speak when he could help it. My own accidental cut across the knuckles was a flea bite. Dr. Livesey patched it up and with plaster and pulled my ears for me into the bargain. After dinner, the squire and the doctor sat by the captain's side a while in consultation, and when they had talked to their heart's content, it being then a little past noon, the doctor took up his hat and pistols, girt on a cutlass, put the chart in his pocket, and with a musket over his shoulder, crossed the palisade on the north side, and set off briskly through the trees. Gray and I were sitting together at the far end of the blockhouse to be out of earshot of our officers consulting, and Gray took his pipe out of his mouth and fairly forgot to put it back again, so thunderstruck he was at this occurrence. "Why, in the name of Davy Jones," said he, "is Dr. Livesey mad?" "Why, no," said I. "He's about the last of this crew for that, I take it." "Well, shipmate," said Gray, "mad he may not be, but if he's not, you mark my words, I am." "I take it," replied I, "the doctor has his idea, and if I'm right, he's going now to see Ben Gunn." I was right, as appeared later, but in the meantime, the house being stifling hot and the little patch of sand inside the palisade ablaze with midday sun, I began to get another thought into my head. which was not by any means so right. What I began to do was envy the doctor walking in the cool shadow of the woods with the birds about him and the pleasant smell of pines, while I sat grilling with my clothes stuck to the hot resin, and so much blood about me and so many poor dead bodies lying all around that I took a disgust of the place that was almost as strong as fear. All the time I was washing out the blockhouse and then washing up the things from dinner, this disgust and envy kept growing stronger and stronger, till at last, being near a bread bag and no one then observing me, I took the first step towards my escapade and filled both pockets of my coat with biscuit. I was a fool, if you like, and certainly I was going to do a foolish, overbold act, but I was determined to do it with all the precautions in my power. These biscuits, should anything befall me, would keep me, at least, from starving till far on in the next day. The next thing I laid hold of was a brace of pistols. As I already had powder horn and bullets, I felt myself well supplied with arms. As for the scheme I had in my head, it was not a bad one in itself. I was to go down the sandy pit that divides the anchorage on the east from the open sea, find the white rock that I had observed last evening, and ascertain whether it was there or not that Ben Gunn had hidden his boat, a thing quite worth doing, as I still believe. But as I was certain I should not be allowed to leave the enclosure, my only plan was to take French leave and slip out when nobody was watching, and that was so bad a way of doing it that I made the thing itself wrong. But I was only a boy, and I had made my mind up. Well, as things at last fell out, I found an admirable opportunity. The Squire and Grey were busy helping the captain with his bandages. The coast was clear. I made a bolt for it over the stockade and into the thickest of trees. Before my absence was observed, I was out of cry of my companions. This was my second folly, far worse than the first, as I left but 2 sound men to guard the house, but, like the first, it was a help towards saving all of us. I took my way straight for the east coast of the island, for I was determined to go down the seaside of the Spit to avoid all chance of observation from the anchorage. It was already late in the afternoon, although still warm and sunny. As I continued to thread the tall woods, I could hear from far before me not only the continuous thunder of the surf, but a certain tossing of foliage and grinding of boughs, which showed me the sea breeze had set in higher than usual. Soon cool draughts of air began to reach me, and a few steps farther I came forth into the open borders of the grove and saw the sea lying blue and sunny to the horizon, and the surf tumbling and tossing its foam upon the beach. I have never seen the sea quiet round Treasure Island. The sun might blaze overhead, the air be without breath, the surface smooth and blue, but still these great rollers would be running along all the external coast, thundering and thundering by day and night. I scarce believe there is one spot on the island where a man would be out of earshot of their noise. I walked along beside the surf with great enjoyment, till, thinking I was now got far enough to the south, I took cover of some thick bushes and crept warily up the ridge of the Spit. Behind me was the sea in front of the anchorage. The sea breeze, as though it had been sooner blown itself out of the unusual violence, was already at an end. It had been succeeded by light variable airs from the south and southeast, carrying great banks of fog, and the anchorage, under lee of Skeleton Island, lay still and leaden as when first we entered it. The Hispaniola, in that unbroken mirror, was exactly portrayed from the truck of the waterline, the Jolly Roger hanging from her peak. Alongside lay one of the gigs, silver in the stern sheets, him I could always recognise, while a couple of men were leaning over the stern bulwarks, one of them with a red cap, the very rogue that I had seen some hours before stride legs upon the palisade. Apparently they were talking and laughing, though at that distance, upwards of a mile, I could of course hear no word of what was said. All at once I began the most horrid, unearthly screaming, which at first startled me badly, though I had soon remembered the voice of Captain Flint, and even thought I could make out the bird by her bright plumage as she sat perched upon the master's wrist. Soon after, the jolly boat shoved off and pulled for shore, and the man with the red cap and his comrade went below by the cabin companion. Just about the same time, the sun had gone down behind the spyglass. As the fog was collecting rapidly, it began to grow dark in earnest. I saw I must lose no time if I were to find the boat that evening. The white rock, visible enough above the brush, was still some 1/8 of a mile further down the Spit, and it took me a goodish while to get up with it, crawling often on all fours among the scrub. Night had come almost when I'd laid my hand on its rough sides. Right below it was an exceedingly small hollow of green turf, hidden by banks and a thick underwood about knee deep, that grew there very plentifully in the centre of the dell. Sure enough, a little tent of goat skins, like what the gypsies carry about with them in England. I dropped into the hollow, lifted the side of the tent, and there was Ben Gunn's boat, homemade if anything was ever homemade, a rude, lopsided framework of tough wood, and stretched upon that a covering of goat skin with the hair inside. The thing was extremely small, even for me, and I could hardly imagine that it would have floated with a full-sized man. There was one thwart set as low as possible, a kind of stretcher in the bows, a double paddle for propulsion. I had not then seen a coracle such as the ancient Britons made, but I have seen one since, and I give you no fairer idea of Ben Gunn's boat than by saying it was like the first and the worst coracle ever made by man. But the great advantage of the coracle it certainly possessed, for it was exceedingly light and portable. Well, now that I had found a boat, you would have thought I had enough of truancy for once, but in the meantime I had taken another notion, become so obstinately fond of it that I have carried it out, I believe, in the teeth of Captain Smollett himself. This was to slip out under the cover of night, cut the Hispaniola adrift, and let her go ashore where she fancied. I quite made up my mind that the mutineers, after their repulse of the evening, had nothing nearer their hearts than to set up anchor and away to sea. This, I thought, would be a fine thing to prevent. Now that I had seen how they left their watchmen unprovided with a boat, I thought it might be done with little risk. Down I sat to wait for darkness, and made a hearty meal of biscuit. It was a night out of 10,000 for my purpose. The fog had now buried all heaven. As the last rays of daylight dwindled and disappeared, absolute blackness settled down on Treasure Island. And when at last I shouldered the coracle and groped my way stumblingly out of the hollow where I had supped, there were but 2 points visible on the whole anchorage. One was the great fire on shore by which the defeated pirates lay carousing in the swamp. The other, a mere blur of light upon the darkness, indicated the position of the anchored ship. She had swung round to the ebb. Her bow was now towards me. The only lights on board were in the cabin, and what I saw was merely a reflection of the fog on the strong rays that flowed from the stern window. The ebb had already run some time. I had to wade through a long belt of swampy sand, where I sank several times above the ankle before I came to the edge of the retreating water, and wading a little way in with some strength and dexterity, set my coracle keel downwards on the surface. Chapter 23. Tide runs. The coracle, as I had ample reason to know before I was done with her, was a very safe boat for a person of my height and weight, both buoyant and clever in a seaway, but she was the most cross-gained, lopsided craft to manage. Do as you pleased, she always made more leeway than anything else, and turning round and round was the manoeuvre she was best at. Even Ben Gunn himself has admitted that she was queer to handle till you knew her way. Certainly I did not know her way. She turned in every direction but the one I was bound to go. The most part of time we were broadside on, and I am very sure I would never have made the ship at all but for the tide. By good fortune, paddle as I pleased, the tide was still sweeping me down, and there lay the Hispaniola right in the fairway, hardly to be missed. First she loomed before me like a blot of something yet blacker than darkness. Then her spars and hull began to take shape, and the next moment, as it seemed, for the farther I went, the brisker grew the current of the ebb, I was alongside of her hawser, and had laid hold. The hawser was as taut as a bowstring, and the current so strong that she pulled upon her anchor. All round the hull, in the darkness, the rippling current bubbled and chattered like a mountain stream. One cut with my sea gully, and the Hispaniola would be humming down the tide. So far, so good. But it next occurred to my recollection that a taut hawser suddenly cut is a thing as dangerous as a kicking horse. 10 to 1, if I was so foolhardy as to cut the Hispaniola from her anchor, I and the coracle would be knocked clean out of the water. This brought me to a full stop, and if fortune had not again particularly favoured me, I should have had to abandon my design. But the light airs which had just begun flowing from the south-east and south had hauled round after nightfall into the south-west. Just while I was meditating, a puff came, caught the Hispaniola, and forced her up into the current, and, to my great joy, I felt the hawser slacken my grasp, and the hand by which I held it dip for a second under water. With that, I made my mind up, took out of my gully, opened it with my teeth, and cut one strand after another till the vessel swung only by two. Then I lay quiet, waiting to sever the last when the strain should be once more lightened by a breath of wind. All this time I had heard the sound of loud voices from the cabin, but, to say truth, my mind had been so entirely taken up by other thoughts that I had scarcely given ear. Now, however, when I had nothing else to do, I began to pay more heed. One I recognised for the coxswain's. Israel Hands had been Flint's gunner in former days. The other was, of course, my friend of the red nightcap. Both men were plainly the worst of drink, and they were still drinking, for even while I was listening, one of them, with a drunken cry, opened the stern window and threw something out, which I divined to be an empty bottle. But they were not only tipsy, it was plain that they were furiously angry. Oaths flew like hailstones, and every now and then came forth such an explosion as I thought was sure to end in blows. But each time the quarrel passed off, and the voices grumbled lower for a while, until the next crisis came, and in its turn passed away without result. On shore, I could see the glow of the great campfire burning warmly through the shoreside trees. Someone was singing a dull old droning sailor's song, with a droop and a quaver at the end of every verse, and seemingly no end to it at all but the patience of the singer. I had heard it on the voyage more than once, and remembered these words: "Put one man of her crew alive, what put to sea was 75." And I thought it was a ditty rather too dolefully appropriate for a company that met such cruel losses in the morning. But indeed, from what I saw, all these buccaneers were as callous as the sea they sailed on. At last the breeze came, the schooner sidled and drew nearer in the dark, felt the hawser slacken once more, and with a good tough effort cut the last fibres through. The breeze had but little action at the coracle, and I was almost instantly swept against the bows of the Hispaniola. At the same time the schooner began to turn upon her heel, spinning slowly, end for end, across the current. I wrought like a fiend, for I expected every moment to be swamped, and since I found I could not push the coracle directly off, I now shoved straight astern. At length I was clear of my dangerous neighbour, and just as I gave the last impulsion, my hands came across a light cord that was trailing overboard across the stern bulwarks. Instantly I grasped it. Why I should have done so, I can hardly say. It was at first mere instinct, but once I had in my hands, I found it fast, curiously began to get the upper hand, and I determined I should have one look through the cabin window. I pulled in hand over hand on the cord, and when I judged myself near enough, rose at infinite risk to about half my height, and thus commanded the roof and a slice of the interior of the cabin. By this time the schooner and her little consort were gliding pretty swiftly through the water. Indeed, we had already fetched up level with the campfires. The ship was talking, as sailors say, loudly, treading the innumerable ripples with an incessant weltering splash, and until I got my eye above the window-sill, I could not comprehend why the watchman had taken no alarm. One glance, however, was sufficient. It was only one glance that I durst take from the unsteady skiff. It showed me Hans and his companion locked together in deadly wrestle, each with a hand upon the other's throat. I dropped upon the thwart again, none too soon, for I was near overboard. I could see nothing for the moment but these two furious and crimsoned faces swaying together under the smoky lamp, and I shut my eyes to let them grow once more familiar with the darkness. The endless ballad had come to an end at last, and the whole diminished company about the campfire had broken into the chorus I had heard so often. 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Drink and the devil have done for the rest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle. I was just thinking how busy drink and the devil were at the very moment in the cabin of the Hispaniola, when I was surprised by a sudden lurch of the coracle. At the same moment she yawed sharply and seemed to change her course. The speed in the meantime had strangely increased. I opened my eyes at once. All round me were little ripples combing over with a sharp, bristling sound and slight phosphorescence. The Hispaniola herself, a few yards in whose wake I was still being whirled along, seemed to stagger in her course, and I saw her spars toss a little against the blackness of the night. Nay, as I looked longer, I made sure that she was wheeling to the southward. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart jumped against my ribs. There, right behind me, was the glow of the campfire. The current had turned at right angles, sweeping round along with the tall schooner and the little dancing coracle, ever quickening, ever bubbling higher, ever muttering louder. It went spinning through the narrows of the open sea. Suddenly the schooner in front of me gave a violent yaw, turning perhaps through 20 degrees, and almost at the same moment one shout followed another from aboard. I could hear feet pounding on the companion ladder, and I knew that the two drunkards had at last been interrupted in their quarrel and awakened to a sense of their disaster. I lay down flat in the bottom of that wretched skiff, and devoutly recommended my spirit to its Maker. At the end of the straits I made sure we must fall into some bar of raging breakers, where all my troubles would be ended speedily, and though I could perhaps bear to die, I could not bear to look upon my fate as it approached. So I must have lain for hours, continually beaten to and fro upon the billows, now and again wetted with flying sprays, and never ceasing to expect death at the next plunge. Gradually weariness grew upon me, a numbness, an occasional stupor fell upon my mind even in the midst of my terrors, until sleep at last supervened in my sea-tossed coracle, as I lay and dreamed of home and the old Admiral Benbow. Chapter 24. The Cruise of the Coracle. It was broad day when I awoke, and found myself tossing at the south-west end of Treasure Island. The sun was up, but was still hid from behind me the great bulk of the spyglass, which, on this side, descended almost to the sea in formidable cliffs. Hull bowline head and mizzenmast hill were at the elbow, the hill bare and dark, the head bound with cliffs 40 or 50 feet high and fringed with great masses of fallen rock. I was scarce a quarter of a mile to seaward, and it was my first thought to paddle in and land. The notion was soon given over. Among the fallen rocks the breakers spouted and bellowed, loud reverberations, heavy sprays flying and falling, succeeding one another from second to second, and I saw myself, if I ventured nearer, dashed to death upon the rough shore of spending my strength in vain to scale the beetling crags. Nor was that all, for crawling together on flat tables of rock or letting themselves drop into the sea with loud reports, I beheld huge slimy monsters, soft snails as it were, of incredible bigness, 2 or 3 score of them together, making rocks to echo with their barkings. I have understood since that they were sea lions and entirely harmless, but the look of them, added to the difficulty of the shore and the high running of the surf, was more than enough to disgust me of their landing pace. I felt willing rather to starve at sea than to confront such peril. In the meantime, I had a better chance, as I supposed, before me. North of Hull bowline head, the land runs in a long way, leaving a low tide a long stretch of yellow sand. To the north of that, again, there comes another cape, Cape of the Woods, as it is marked upon the chart, buried in tall green pines which descended to the margin of the sea. I remembered what Silver had said about the currents and the sets northward along the whole west coast of Treasure Island, and seeing from my position that I was already under its influence, I preferred to leave Hull bowline head behind me and reserve my strength for an attempt to land upon the kindlier-looking Cape of the Woods. There was a great smooth swell upon the sea, the wind blowing steadily and gently from the south. There was no contrary between that and the current, and the billows rose and fell unbroken. Had it been otherwise, I must long ago have perished, but as it was surprising how easily and securely my little and light boat could ride. Often as I still lay at the bottom and kept no more than an eye above the gunwale, I would see a big blue summit heaving close above me, yet the coracle would but bounce a little, dance as if on springs, and subside on the other side into the trough as lightly as a bird. I began after a while to grow very bold, and sat up to try my skill at paddling, but even a small change in the disposition of the weight will produce violent changes in the behaviour of a coracle. And I had hardly moved before the boat, giving up at once her gentle dancing movement, ran straight down a slope of water so steep that it made me giddy, and struck her nose with a spout of spray deep into the side of the next wave. I was drenched and terrified, and fell instantly back into my old position, whereupon the coracle seemed to find her head again, and led me as softly as before among the billows. It was plain she could not be interfered with, and at that rate, since I could in no way influence her course, what hope had I left of reaching land? I began to be horribly frightened, but I kept my head for all that. First, moving with all care, I gradually bailed out the coracle with my sea cap. Then, getting my eye once more above the gunwale, I set myself to study how it was she managed to slip so quietly through the rollers. I found each wave, instead of the big, smooth, glossy mountain it looks from the shore or from a vessel's deck, was for all the world like any range of hills on dry land, full of peaks and smooth places and valleys. The coracle, left to herself, turning from side to side, threaded, so to speak, her way through those lower parts and avoided the steep slopes and higher toppling summits of the wave. Well now, thought I to myself, it is plain I must lie where I am and not disturb the balance, but it is plain also that I can put the paddle over the side and, from time to time, in smooth places, give her a shove or two towards land. No sooner thought upon that done. There I lay on my elbows in the most trying attitude, and every now and again gave a weak stroke or two to turn her head to shore. It was very tiring and slow work, yet I did visibly gain ground. As we drew near the Cape of the Woods, though I saw I must infallibly miss that point, I had still made some 100 yards of easting. I was indeed close in. I could see the cool green treetops swaying towards in the breeze, and I felt sure I should make the next promontory without fail. It was high time, for I now began to be tortured with thirst. The glow of the sun from above, its thousand-fold reflection from the waves, the sea water that fell and dried upon me, caking my very lips with salt, combined to make my throat burn and my brain ache. The sight of the trees so near at hand had almost made me sick with longing, but the current had soon carried me past that point, and as the next reach of sea opened out, I beheld a sight that changed the nature of my thoughts. Right in front of me, not half a mile away, I beheld the Hispaniola under sail. I made sure, of course, that I should be taken, but I was so distressed for want of water that I scarce knew whether to be glad or sorry at the thought, and long before I had come to a conclusion, surprise had taken entire possession of my mind, and I could do nothing but stare and wonder. The Hispaniola was under her mainsail and 2 jibs, and the beautiful white canvas shone in the sun like snow or silver. When I first sighted her, all her sails were drawing. She was lying a course about northwest, and I presumed the men on board were going round the island on their way back to the anchorage. Presently she began to fetch more and more to the westward, so that I thought they had sighted me and were going about in chase. At last, however, she fell right into the wind's eye, was taken dead aback, and stood there a while helpless, with her sails shivering. Clumsy fellows, said I, must still be drunk as owls, and I thought her Captain Smollett would have set them skipping. Meanwhile the schooner gradually fell off and filled again upon another tack, sailed swiftly for a minute or so, and brought up once more dead in the wind's eye. Again and again was this repeated, to and fro, up and down, north, south, east and west. The Hispaniola sailed by swoops and dashes, and each repetition ended as she had begun, with idly flapping canvas. It became plain to me that nobody was steering, and if so, where were the men? Either they were dead drunk or had deserted her, I thought, and perhaps I could get aboard, might return the vessel to her captain. The current was bearing coracle and schooner southward at an equal rate. As for the latter's sailing, it was so wild and intermittent, and she hung each time so long in irons that she certainly gained nothing if she did not even lose. If only I dared to sit upon a paddle, I made sure that I could overhaul her. The scheme had an air of adventure that inspired me, and the thought of the water breaker beside the fore companion doubled my growing courage. Up I got, was welcomed almost instantly by another cloud of spray, this time stuck into my purpose, and set myself with all my strength and caution to paddle after the unsteered Hispaniola. Once I shipped a sea so heavy that I had to stop and bail, and my heart fluttering like a bird, but gradually I got into the way of the thing, and guided my coracle among the waves, with only now and then a blow upon her bows, and a stash of foam in my face. I was now gaining rapidly on the schooner. I could see the brass glisten on the tiller as it banged about, and still no soul appearing upon her decks. I could not choose, but perhaps she was deserted. If not, the men were lying drunk below, where I might batten them down, perhaps, and do what I chose with the ship. For some time she'd been doing the worst thing possible for me, standing still. She headed nearly due south, yawing, of course, all the time. Each time she fell off, her sails partly filled, and these brought in her a moment right to the wind again. I have said that this was the worst thing possible for me, for helpless as she looked in the situation, with the canvas cracking like cannon and the blocks trundling and banging on the deck, she still continued to run away from me, not only with the speed of the current, but with the whole amount of her leeway, which was naturally great. But now at last I had my chance. The breeze fell for some seconds very low, and the current gradually turning her, the Hispaniola revolved slowly round her centre, and at last presenting me her stern, with her cabin window still gaping open, and the lamp over the table still burning on into the day. The mainsail hung, drooped like a banner. She was still but for the current. For the last little, while I had even lost, but now redoubled my efforts, I began once more to overhaul the chase. I was not 100 yards from her when the wind came again in a clap. She filled on the port tack and was off again, stooping and skimming like a swallow. My first impulse was one of despair, but my second was towards joy. Round she came till she was broadside to me, round still till she had covered a half and then 2/3 and then 3/4 of the distance that separated us. I could see the waves boiling white under her forefoot. Immensely tall she looked to me from my low station of the coracle. And then, of a sudden, I began to comprehend. I had scarce time to think, scarce time to act and save myself. I was on the summit of one swell when the schooner came stooping over the next. The bowsprit was over my head. I sprang to my feet and leapt, stamping the coracle under water. With one hand I caught the jib boom while my foot was lodged between the stay and the brace, and as I still clung there, panting, a dull blow told me that the schooner had charged down upon and struck the coracle, that I was left without retreat on the Hispaniola. Chapter 25. I Strike the Jolly Roger. I had scarce gained a position on the bowsprit when the flying jib flapped and filled on upon the other tack with a report like a gun. The schooner trembled to her keel under the reverse, but next moment, the other sails still drawing, the jib flapped back again and hung idle. This had nearly tossed me off into the sea, and now I lost no time, crawled back upon the bowsprit, and tumbled head foremost on the deck. I was on the lee side of the forecastle, and the mainsail, which was still drawing, concealed from me a certain portion of the afterdeck. Not a soul was to be seen. The planks, which had not been swabbed since the mutiny, bore the print of many feet. An empty bottle, broken by the neck, tumbled to and fro like a live thing in the scuppers. Suddenly the Hispaniola came right into the wind. The jibs behind me cracked aloud, and the rudder slammed to, and the whole ship gave a sickening heave and shudder, and at the same moment the main boom swung inboard, the sheet groaning in the blocks, and showed me the lee after deck. There were 2 watchmen, sure enough, Redcap on his back, as stiff as a handspike, with his arms outstretched like those of a crucifix, and his teeth showing through his open lips. Israel Hands propped against the bulwarks, his chin on his chest, his hands lying open before him on the deck, his face as white under its tan as a tallow candle. For a while the ship kept buckling and sidling like a vicious horse, the sails filling now on one tack, now on another, and the boom swinging to and fro till the most groaned aloud under the strain. Now and again, too, there would come a cloud of light sprays under the bulwark, and a heavy blow of the ship's bows made against the swell. So much heavier weather was made of it in the great rich ship than by my homemade lopsided coracle, now gone to the bottom of the sea. At every jump of the schooner, Redcap slipped to and fro, But from what was ghastly to behold, neither his attitude nor his fixed teeth disclosing grin was any way disturbed by the rough usage. Every jump too, Hans appeared still more to sink into himself and settle down upon the deck, his feet sliding ever farther out and the whole body canting towards the stern, so that his face became, little by little, hid from me. At last I could see nothing beyond his ear and frayed ringlet of one whisker. At the same time I observed, around both of them, splashes of dark blood upon the planks, and began to feel sure they had killed each other in their drunken wrath. While I was thus looking and wondering in a calm moment when the ship was still, Israel Hands turned partly round with a low moan, writhed himself to the position in which I had seen him first. The moan, which told of pain and deadly weakness, and the way in which his jaw hung open, went right to my heart. But then I remembered the talk I'd overheard from the apple barrel. All pity left me. I walked aft until I reached the main mast. "Come aboard, Mr. Hands," I said ironically. He rolled his eyes round heavily, but he was too far gone to express surprise. All he could do was to utter one word: brandy. It occurred to me there was no time to lose, and dodging the boom as it was, more lurched across the deck. I slipped aft and down the companion stairs into the cabin. It was such a scene of confusion as you can hardly fancy. All the lock-fast places had been broken open in quest of the chart. The floor was thick with mud where ruffians had sat down to drink or consult after wading in the marshes round the camp. The bulkheads, all painted in clear white and beaded round with gilt, bore a pattern of dirty hands. Dozens of empty bottles clinked together in corners to the rolling of the ship. One of the doctor's medical books lay open on the table, half of the leaves gutted out, I suppose, for pipe lights. In the midst of all this, the lamp still cast a smoky glow, obscure and brown as umber. I went into the cellar. All the barrels were gone, and of the bottles a most surprising number had been drunk out and thrown away. Certainly, since the mutiny began, not a man of them could ever have been sober. Foraging about, I found a bottle with some brandy left for Hans, and for myself I routed out some biscuits, some pickled fruit, a great bunch of raisins, and a piece of cheese. With these I came on deck, put down my own stock behind the rudder head, and well out of the coxswain's reach, went forward to the water breaker, and had a good deep drink of water, and then, and not till then, gave Hans the brandy. He must have drunk a gill before he took the bottle from his mouth. "Aye," said he, "by thunder, but I wanted some of that." I had sat down already in my own corner and began to eat. "Much hurt?" I asked him. He grunted, or rather I might say he barked. "If that doctor was aboard," he said, "I'd be right enough in a couple of turns, but I don't have no manner of luck, you see, and that's what's the matter with me. As for the swab, he's good and dead. He is," he added, indicating the man with the red cap. "He weren't no seaman anyhow. Any mort you have come from?" "Well," said I, "I've come aboard to take possession of this ship, Mr. Hands, and you'll please regard me as your captain until further notice." He looked at me sourly enough, but said nothing. Some of the colour had come back into his cheeks, though he looked very sick and still continued to slip out and settle down as the ship banged about. "By the by," I continued, "I can't have these colours, Mr. Hands, and by your leave I'll strike them. Better none than these." And again, dodging the boom, I ran to the colour lines, handed down the cursed black flag, and chucked it overboard. "God save the King," said I, waving my cap, "and there's an end to Captain Silver." He watched me keenly and slyly, his chin all while on his breast. "I reckon," he said at last, "I reckon, Captain Hawkins, you'll kind of want to get ashore now. Suppose we talks." "Why, yes," says I, "with all my heart, Mr. Hands. Say on." And I went back to my meal with a good appetite. "This man," he began, nodding feebly at the corpse, "O'Brien were his name, a rank islander. This man and me got the canvas on her, meaning for her to sail her back. Well, he's dead now, he is, as dead as bilge, and who's to sail the ship, I don't see. Without I gives you a hint, you ain't that man as far as I can tell. Now, look here, you gives me food and drink, and an old scarf and handkerchief to tie my wounds up, you do, and I'll tell you how to sail her. And that's about square all round, I take it." "I'll tell you one thing," says I. "I'm not going back to Captain Kidd's anchorage. I mean to get into the North Inlet and beach her quietly there." "To be sure you did," he cried. Why ain't such an infernal lubber after all? I can see, can't I? I've tried my fling, I have, and I've lost. And it's you who has the wind of me. North Inlet? Why, I haven't no choice, not I. I'd help you sail her up the execution dock, by thunder, so I would. Well, as it seemed to me, there was some sense in this. We struck our bargain on the spot. In 3 minutes I had the Hispaniola sailing easily before the wind along the coast of Treasure Island, with good hopes of turning the northern point ere noon and beating down again as far as the North Inlet before high water. Then we might reach her safely and wait till the subsiding tide permitted us to land. Then I lashed the tiller and went below to my own chest, where I got a soft silk handkerchief of my mother's. With this, and with my aid, Hans bound up the great bleeding stab he had received in the thigh, and after he had eaten a little and had a swallow or two of the brandy, he began to pick up visibly, sat straighter up, spoke louder and clearer, and looked in every way another man. The breeze served us admirably. We skimmed before it like a bird, the coast of the island flashing by, and the view changing every minute. Soon we were past the highlands and bowling beside low, sandy country, sparsely dotted with dwarf pines, and soon we were beyond that again, and had turned the corner of the rocky hill that ends the island on the north. I was greatly elated with my new command, and pleased with the bright sunshiny weather and these different prospects of the coast. I had now plenty of water and good things to eat, and my conscience, which had smitten me hard for my desertion, was quieted by the great conquest I had made. I should think have had nothing left of me but desire for the eyes of the coxswain as they followed me derisively about the deck, and the odd smile that appeared continually on his face. It was a smile that had in it something both of pain and weakness, a haggard old man's smile, but there was, besides that, a grain of derision, a shadow of treachery in his expression as he craftily watched and watched and watched me at my work. Chapter 26. Israel Hands. The wind, serving us to a desire, now hauled into the west, could run so much the easier from the northeast corner of the island to the mouth of the North Inlet. Only as we had no power to anchor and dared not beach her till the tide had flowed a good deal farther, time hung on our hands. The coxswain told me how to lay the ship to. After a good many trials, I succeeded, and we both sat in silence over another meal. Captain, said he at length, with the same uncomfortable smile, here's my old shipmate, O'Brien. Suppose you was to heave him overboard. I ain't particular as to rule. I don't like to blame for settling his hash, but I don't reckon him ornamental now, do you? I'm not strong enough, and I don't like the job, and there he lies for me, said I. This here's an unlucky ship, this Hispaniola, Jim, he went on, blinking. There's a power of men being killed in this Hispaniola, a sight of poor seamen dead and gone since you and me took ship to Bristol. I never seen such dirty luck, not I. There was this here O'Brien now. He's dead, ain't he? Well now, I'm no scholar, and you're a lad as can read and figure, and to put it straight, do you take it as a dead man is dead for good, or do he come alive again? You can kill the body, Mr. Hans, but not the spirit. You must know that already, I replied. O'Brien there is in another world, and may be watching us. Ah, says he. Well, that's unfortunate. It appears as if killing parties was a waste of time. Howsoever, spirits don't reckon for much from what I've seen. I'll chance it with the spirits, Jim, and now you spoke up free, I'll take it kind if you don't step down into that cabin and get me well, shiver my timbers, I can't hit the name of it. Well, you get me a bottle of wine, Jim. That here brandy's too strong for my head. Now the coxswain's hesitation seemed to be unnatural, and as for the notion of his preferred wine to brandy, I entirely disbelieved it. The whole story was a pretext. He wanted me to leave the deck. So much was plain, but with what purpose I could in no way imagine. His eyes never met mine. They kept wandering to and fro, up and down, now with a look to the sky, now with a flitting glance upon the dead O'Brien. All the time he kept smiling and putting his tongue out in the most guilty, embarrassed manner, so that a child could have told him he was bent on some deception. I was prompt with my answer, however, for I saw where my advantage lay, and that with a fellow so densely stupid I could easily conceal my suspicions to the end. Some wine, I said. Far better. Will you have white or red? Well, I reckon it's about blessed same to me, shipmate, he replied. So it's strong and plenty of it. What's the odds? All right, I answered. I'll bring you port, Mr. Hands, but I'll have to dig for it. With that, I scuttled down the companion with all the noise I could, slipped off my shoes, ran quietly along the sparred galley, mounted the forecastle ladder, and popped my head out to the fore companion. I knew he could not expect to see me yet I took every precaution possible, and certainly the worst of my suspicions proved to be true. He had risen from his position, so his hands and knees, and though his leg obviously hurt him pretty sharply when he moved, for I could hear him stifle a groan, yet it was good rattling rate that he trailed himself across the deck. In half a minute he'd reached the port scuppers and picked out of a coil of rope a long knife, or rather a short dirk, discoloured of the hilt of blood. He looked upon it for a moment, thrusting forth his underjaw, tried the point upon his hand, and then hastily concealed it in the bosom of his jacket, trundled back again into his old place against the bulwark. This was all I required to know. Israel could move about. He was now armed, and if it had been so much trouble to get rid of me, it was plain that I was meant to be the victim. What he could do afterwards, whether he would try to crawl right across the island from the north inlet to the camp among the swamps, or whether he would fire Long Tom, trusting his own comrades might come first to help him, was of course more than I could say. Yet I felt sure that I could trust him at one point, since in our interest jumped together, and that was in the disposition of the schooner. Both desired to have her stranded safe enough in a sheltered place, and so that when the time came, he could have got off again with as little labour and danger as might be. Until that was done, I considered my life would certainly be spared. While I was thus turning the business over in my mind, I had not been idle with the body. I had stolen back to the cabin, slipped once more into my shoes, and laid my hand on a random bottle of wine. And now, with this for an excuse, I made my reappearance upon deck. Hands lay as I had left him, all fallen together in a bundle, and with his eyelids lowered as though he were too weak to bear the light. He looked up, however, at my coming, knocked the neck off my bottle like a man who had done the same thing often, and took a good swig, with his favourite toast of "Here's luck." Then he lay quiet for a little, and then pulling out a stick of tobacco, begged me to cut him a quid. "Cut me a junk of that," he says, "for I haven't no knife, and hardly strength enough, so be as I had. Ah, Jim, I reckon I've missed stays. Cut me a quid, as likely be the last lad from my long home, and no mistake." "Well," said I, "I'll cut you some tobacco, but if I was you and thought myself so badly, I would go to my prayers like a Christian man." "Why?" said he. "Now you tell me why." "Why?" I cried. "You asked me just now about the dead. You've broken your trust. You've lived in sin and lies and blood. There's a man you killed lying at your feet this moment, and you ask me why? For God's mercy, Mr. Hand, that's why." I spoke with a little heat, thinking of the bloody dirk he had hidden in his pocket and designed in his ill thoughts to end me with. He, for his part, took a great draught of wine and spoke with most unusual solemnity. "For 30 years," he said, "I've sailed the seas and seen good and bad, better and worse, fair weather and foul, provisions running out, knives going and what not. Well, now I tell you, I never seen good come of goodness yet. Him as strikes first in my fancy, dead men don't bite. Them's my views. Amen, so it be. And now you look here," he added, suddenly changing his tone. "We've had enough of this foolery. The tide's made good enough by now. You just take my orders, Captain Hawkins, and we'll sail slap in and be done with it." All told, we had scarce 2 miles to run, but the navigation was delicate. The entrance to this northern anchorage was not only narrow and shoal, but lay east and west, so that the schooner must be nicely handled to be got in. I think I was a good, prompt subaltern, but I am very sure that Hans was an excellent pilot, for we went about and dodged in, shaving the banks with a certainty and a neatness that was a pleasure to behold. Scarcely we had passed their heads before the land closed around us. The shores of the North Inlet were as thickly wooded as those at the southern anchorage, but the space was longer and narrower, and more like what in truth it was, the estuary of a river. Right before us at the southern end we saw the wreck of a ship in the last stages of dilapidation. It had been a great vessel of 3 masts, but lain so long exposed to the injuries of the weather that it was hung about with great webs of dripping seaweed, and on the deck its shore bushes had taken root and now flourished thick with flowers. It was a sad sight, but it showed us that the anchorage was calm. "Now," said Hans, "look by. There's a pet bit to beach a ship in. Fine flat sand, never a cat's paw, trees all round of it, and flowers are blowing like a garden on that old ship." "And once beached," I inquired, "how shall we get her off again?" "Why, so," he replied. "You take a line ashore there on the other side at low water, take a turn about one of them big pines, bring it back, take a turn around the capstan, and lie to it for the tide. Come high water, all hands take a pull upon the line, and off she comes as sweet as nature. And now, boy, you stand by. We're near the bit now, and she's too much way on her. Starboard a little, so, steadily, starboard, lie aboard now, steady, steady." So he issued his commands, while I breathlessly obeyed, till, all of a sudden, he cried, "Now, my hearty luff!" And I put the helm hard up, and the Hispaniola swung round rapidly and ran stem on for the low wooded shore. The excitement of these last manoeuvres had somewhat interfered with the watch I had kept hitherto, sharply enough upon the coxswain. Even then I was still so much interested waiting for the ship to touch that I had quite forgotten the peril that hung over my head, and stood craning over the starboard bulwarks and watched the ripples spreading wide before the bows. I might have fallen without a struggle for my life had I not sudden disquiet seized upon me and made me turn my head. Perhaps I'd heard a creak, or seen his shadow moving with the tail of my eye. Perhaps it was an instinct like a cat's. But sure enough, when I looked around, there was Hans, already halfway towards me, with the dirk in his right hand. We must both have cried out aloud when our eyes met, but while mine was a shrill cry of terror, his was a roar of fury like a charging bully's. At the same instant he flew himself forward, and I leapt sideways towards the bows. And as I did, I let go of the tiller, which sprang sharp to the leeward, and I think this saved my life, for it struck Hans across the chest and stopped him for a moment dead. Before he could recover, I was safe out of the corner where he had me trapped, with all the deck to dodge about. Just forward of the mainmast I stopped, drew a pistol from my pocket, took a cool aim, though it had already turned, and once more was coming directly upon me, and I drew the trigger. The hammer fell, and there followed neither flash nor sound. The priming was useless with sea water. I cursed myself for my neglect. Why had not I long before reprimed and reloaded my only weapons? Then I should not have been as now a mere fleeing sheep before this butcher. Wounded as he was, it was wonderful how fast he could move, his grizzled hair tumbling up all about his face, and his face itself as red as a red ensign with its hastened fury. I had no time to try my other pistol, nor indeed much inclination, for as I was sure it would be useless. One thing I saw plainly: I must not simply retreat before him, or he would speedily hold me boxed into the bows, as a moment since he had so nearly boxed me in the stern. Once so caught, and 9 or 10 inches of blood-stained dirk would be my last experience on this eternity. I placed my palms against the mainmast, which was of goodish bigness, and waited every nerve upon that stretch. Seeing that I meant to dodge, he also paused, and a moment or two passed in feints on his part, and corresponding movements upon mine. It was such a game as I often played at home with the rocks of Black Hill Cove, and never before, you might be sure, with such a wildly beating heart as now. Still, as I say, it was a boy's game, and I thought I could hold my own at it against an elderly seaman with a wounded thigh. Indeed, my courage had begun to rise so high that I allowed myself a few darting thoughts on what might be the end of the affair, and while I saw certainly that I could spin it out for a long, I saw no hope of ultimate escape. Well, while things stood thus, suddenly the Hispaniola struck, staggered ground for an instant in the sand, and then, swift as a blow, canted over to the port side till the deck stood at an angle of 45 degrees, and about a puncheon of water splashed into the scupper holes and lay in a pool between the deck and bulwark. We were both of us capsized in a second, and both of us rolled almost together into the scuppers. The dead red cap, with his arms still spread out, tumbled stiffly against us. So near were we indeed, my head came against the coxswain's foot with a crack that made my teeth rattle. Blow and all, I was first afoot again, and Hans had got involved with the dead body. The sudden canting of the ship had made the deck no place for running on. I had to find some new way to escape, and that upon the instant, for my foe was almost touching me. Quick as I thought, I sprang into the mizzen shrouds, rattled up hand over hand, did not draw a breath till I was seated on the cross trees. I had been saved by being prompt. The dirk had struck not half a foot below me as I pursued my upward flight, and there stood Israel Hands with his mouth open and face upturned to mine, a perfect statue of surprise and disappointment. Now that I had a moment to myself, I lost my time in changing the priming of my pistol, and then, having one ready for service, and to make assurance doubly sure, I proceeded to draw the load of the other and recharge it afresh from the beginning. My new employment struck Hands all of a heap. He began to see the dice going against him, and after an obvious hesitation, he also hauled himself heavily into the shrouds, with the dirk in his teeth, and began slowly and painfully to mount. It cost him no end of time and groans to haul his wounded leg behind him, and I had quietly finished my arrangements before he was much more than a third of the way up. Then, with a pistol in either hand, I addressed him. "One more step, Mr. Hands," said I, "and I'll blow your brains out. Dead men don't bite, you know," I added with a chuckle. He stopped instantly. I could see by the working of his face that he was trying to think, and the process was so slow and laborious that, in my newfound security, I laughed aloud. At last, with a swallow or two, he spoke, his face still wearing the same expression of extreme perplexity. In order to speak, he had to take the dagger from his mouth, but in all else he remained unmoved. "Jim," says he, "I reckon we've fouled, you and me. We'll have to sign articles. I'd had you but for that there lurch, and I don't have no luck, not I, and I reckon I'll have to strike, which comes hard, you see, for a master mariner to ship's younker like yourself, Jim." I was drinking in his words and smiling away, as conceited as a cock up a wall, when, all in a breath, back went his right hand over his shoulder. Something sang like an arrow through the air. I felt a blow and a sharp pang, and I was pinned by the shoulder to the mast. In the horrid pain and surprise of the moment, I can scarce say it was my own volition, and I am sure it was not without a conscious aim. Both my pistols went off, and both escaped out of my hands. They did not fall alone. With a croaked cry, the coxswain loosed his grip upon the shrouds and plunged head first into the water. Chapter 27. Pieces of Eight. Owing to the cant of the vessel, the mast hung far over the water, and from my perch of the cross trees I had nothing below me but the surface of the bay. Hands, who was not so far up, was in consequence nearer to the ship, and fell between me and the bulwarks. He rose once to the surface in a lather of foam and blood, and then sank again for good. As the water settled, I could see him lying huddled together on the clean, bright sand in the shadow of the vessel's sides. A fish or two whipped past his body. Sometimes, by the quivering of the water, he appeared to move a little, as if he were trying to rise, but he was dead enough, for all that, being both shot and drowned, and was food for fish in the very place that he had designed by slaughter. I was no sooner certain of this than I began to feel sick, faint, and terrified. The hot blood was running over my back and chest. The dirk, where it had pinned my shoulder to the mast, seemed to burn like a hot iron. Yet it was not so much these real sufferings that distressed me, but these, it seemed to me, I could bear without a murmur. It was the horror I had upon my mind of falling from the cross trees into that still green water beside the body of the coxswain. I clung with both hands till my nails ached, and I shut my eyes as if to cover up my peril. Gradually my mind came back again, and my pulses quieted down to a more natural time, and I was once more in possession of myself. It was my first thought to pluck forth the dirk, but either it stuck too hard or my nerve failed me, and I desisted with a violent shudder. Oddly enough, that very shudder did the business. The knife, in fact, had come to the nearest in the world to missing me altogether, and it held me by the mere pinch of skin, and this the shoulder tore away. The blood ran down the faster, to be sure, but I was my own master again, and only tacked by the mast by my coat and shirt. These last I broke through with a sudden jerk, and then regained the deck by the starboard shrouds. For nothing in the world would I again ventured, shaken as I was, upon the overhanging port shrouds with which Israel had so lately fallen. I went below and did what I could for my wound. It pained me a great deal, and I still bled freely, but it was neither deep nor dangerous, nor did it greatly gall me when I used my arm. Then I looked around me, and as the ship was now, in a sense, my own, I began to think of clearing it from its last passenger, the dead man, O'Brien. He had pitched, as I had said, against the bulwarks, where he lay like some horrible, ungainly sort of puppet. Life-size indeed, but how different from life's colour or life's comeliness. In that position I could easily have made my way with him, as the habit of tragical adventures had worn off almost all my terror for the dead. I took him by the waist as if it had been a sack of bran, and with one good heave tumbled him overboard. He went in with a sounding plunge. The red cap came off and remained floating on the surface, and as soon as the splash subsided, I could see him and Israel lying side by side, both wavering with the tremulous movement of the water. O'Brien, though still quite a young man, was very bold. There he lay with that bald head across the knees of the man who had killed him, and the quick fishes steering to and fro over both. I was now alone upon the ship. The tide had just turned. The sun was within so few degrees of setting that already the shadow of the pines upon the western shore began to reach right across the anchorage and fall in patterns on the deck. The evening breeze had sprung up, and though it was well warded off by the hill with the two peaks upon the east, the cordage began to sing a little softly to itself, and the idle sails to rattle to and fro. I began to see a danger to the ship. The jibs I speedily doused and brought tumbling to the deck, but the mainsail was a harder matter. Of course, when the schooner canted over, the boom had swung outboard, and the cap of it and a foot or two of the sail hung even under water. I thought this made it more dangerous, yet the strain was so heavy that I half feared to meddle. At last I got my knife and cut the halyards. The peak dropped instantly. A great belly of loose canvas floated broad into the water, and since, pulled as I liked, I could not budge the downhaul, which was the extent to which I could accomplish. For the rest, the Hispaniola must trust to luck, like myself. By this time the whole anchorage had fallen into shadow. The last rays I remember falling through a glade of the wood and shining bright as jewels on the flowery mantle of the wreck. It began to chill. The tide was rapidly fleeting seaward, the schooner settling more and more on the beam ends. I scrambled forward and looked over. It seemed shallow enough, and holding the cut hawser in both hands for a last security, I let myself drop softly overboard. The water scarcely reached my waist. The sand was firm and covered with ripple barks. I waded ashore in great spirits, leaving the Hispaniola on her side, with her main sail trailing wide upon the surface of the bay. About the same time the sun went fairly down, and the breeze whistled low in the dusk upon tossing pines. At last and at last I was off the sea, nor had I returned thence empty-handed. There lay the schooner, clear at last from buccaneers, and ready for our own men to board and get to sea again. I had nothing nearer my fancy than to get home to the stockade and boast of my achievements. Possibly I might be blamed for a bit of my truancy, but the recapture of the Hispaniola was a clenching answer, and I hoped that even Captain Smollett would confess I had not lost my time. So thinking, and in famous spirits, I began to set my face homeward for the blockhouse of my companions. I remembered that most easterly of rivers which drain into Captain Kidd's anchorage ran from the two-peaked hill upon my left. Bent my course in that direction that I might pass the stream while it was small. The wood was pretty open, and keeping along the lower spurs, I had soon turned the corner of the hill, and not long after waded to the mid-calf across the watercourse. This brought me near to where I had encountered Ben Gunn, the maroon, and I looked more circumspectly, keeping an eye on every side. The dusk had come nigh hand completely, and as I opened out the cleft between the two peaks, I became aware of the wavering glow against the sky, whereas I judged the man of the island was cooking his supper before a roaring fire. And yet I wondered in my heart that he should show himself so careless, for if I could see this radiance, might it not reach the eyes of Silver himself when he camped upon the shore among the marshes? Gradually the night fell blacker. It was all I could do to guide myself even roughly towards my destination. The double hill behind me and the spyglass on the right hand loomed fainter and fainter. The stars were few and pale, and in the low ground where I wandered I kept tripping among bushes and rolling into sandy pits. Suddenly a kind of brightness fell about me. I looked up. A pale glimmer of moonbeams had aligned on the summit of the spyglass, and soon after I saw something broad and silver moving slowly down behind the trees, I knew the moon had risen. With this to help me, I passed rapidly over what remained to me of my journey, and sometimes walking, sometimes running, impatiently drew near to the stockade. Yet as I began to thread the grove that lies before it, I was not so thoughtless but that I slacked my pace and went a trifle warily. It would have been a poor end to my adventures to get shot down by my own party in mistake. The moon was climbing higher and higher. Its light began to fall here and there in masses through more open districts of the wood, and right in front of me a glow of a different colour appeared among the trees. It was red and hot, and now again it was a little darkened, as if it were the embers of a bonfire smouldering. For the life of me I could not think what it might be. At last I came right down the borders of the clearing. The western end was already steeped in moonshine. The rest and the blockhouse itself still lay in a black shadow, checkered with the long silvery streaks of light. On the other side of the house, an immense fire had burned itself into clear embers and shed a steady red reverberation, contrasted strongly with the mellow paleness of the moon. There was not a soul stirring, nor a sound beside the noises of the breeze. I stopped, with much wonder in my heart, perhaps a little terror also. It had not been our way to build great fires. We were indeed, by the captain's orders, somewhat niggardly of firewood, and I began to fear something had gone wrong when I was absent. I stole myself by the eastern end, keeping close to the shadow, and at a convenient place where the darkness was thickest, I crossed the palisade. To make assurance surer, I got upon my hands and knees and crawled without a sound towards the corner of the house. As I drew nearer, my heart was suddenly and greatly lightened. It was not a pleasant noise in itself, and I have often complained of it at other times, but just when it was like music to hear my friends snoring together so loud and peaceful in their sleep. The sea cry of the watch, that beautiful "all's well," never fell more reassuringly on my ear. In the meantime, there was no doubt of one thing. They kept an infamous bad watch. If it had been Silver and his lads that were now creeping in on them, not a soul would have seen daybreak. That was what I thought I, to have the captain wounded, and again I blamed myself sharply for leaving them in the danger with so few to mount guard. By this time I got to the door and stood up. All was dark within, so that I could distinguish nothing by the eye, and so for sounds there was a steady drone of snores and a small occasional noise, and flickering or pecking I could in no way account for. With my arms before me, I walked steadily in. I should lie down in my own place, I thought with a silent chuckle, and enjoy their faces when they found me in the morning. My foot struck something yielding. It was a sleeper's leg, and he turned and groaned, but without awaking. And then, all of a sudden, a shrill voice broke forth out of the darkness. "Pieces of 8, pieces of 8, pieces of 8, pieces of 8, pieces of 8, and so forth, without pause or change, like the clacking of a tiny mill. Silver's green parrot, Captain Flint. It was she who I had heard pecking on a piece of bark. It was she, keeping better watch than any human being, whom thus announced my arrival in her wearisome refrain. I had no time left to recover. At the sharp, clipping tone of the parrot, the sleepers awoke and sprang up, and with a mighty oath, the voice of Silver cried, "Who goes?" I turned to run, struck violently against one person, recoiled, and ran full into the arms of a second, who, for his part, closed upon and held me tight. "Bring a torch, Dick," said Silver when my capture was thus assured, and one of the men left the log house and presently returned with a lighted brand. And that brings us to the end of part 5. We have just part 6 left to go. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it. Unless something goes wrong, we will finish our story tomorrow night. We won't go on nearly as late because, as I said, we just have one part left to go. About a sixth of the book or thereabouts. Just to wrap this up with the usual stuff, I mean, this has been a charity stream to raise money for Great Ormond Street Hospital. So please, I beg you, if you can, please donate something to the charity. Please follow the QR code in the bottom right and donate something towards the cause. If you can't, I would ask you, please share the VODs of this, please share the link, and that might encourage donations in other manners. But I absolutely understand if you feel unable to contribute. That is absolutely okay. In terms of wrapping this up, if you don't already do so, please follow me on Twitch and YouTube. I'm at DC Bradshaw on both. You can find me on social media, mostly on Blue Sky at dcbradshaw.com or on Threads at dcbradshaw. If you would like, you can, of course, donate directly to me. I do have a Ko-Fi. The link is there. It's ko-fi.com/DC Bradshaw. But honestly, if you have money to spare, I would rather you give it to Great Ormond Street Hospital this week. I will change my tune once this charity matter is over. But for the time being, I would ask that if you have any spare money to give, please donate it to Great Ormond Street Hospital. It would be amazing to hit our goal by the end of tomorrow night. Okay, I think that is about it. I cannot see anyone streaming. It is a quiet night, and certainly here in the UK, it's about to turn midnight. So I think we will draw this to a close. Thank you once again so much for joining me. We will finish the story tomorrow evening. I expect, again, probably 8, 9 o'clock. We'll see how we get on, and we'll be finished in a reasonable time. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful evening.